Welcome to the Rabbi Daniel Lapin Show. Welcome, you happy warrior, you heroic men enduring the scorching days of summer and the frigid days of winter. You happy warriors who go to work every morning early regardless of whether you feel like it, disciplining yourself and improving yourself, watching over your spouse and children if you have them, and taking care of business, generating cash flow, and doing what your head tells you to do when your head tells you it must be done. You happy warriors who ignore your heart's desire to indulge the body's seductive whisper. Instead, you boldly heed the clarion call of responsibility to those you are strong enough to support and brave enough to love. You are the army of the righteous. You are the noble knights defending the fortress of civilization against the hungry hordes of scheming and surging savages trying to invade and conquer what you and your fathers have built. The barbarians know that even after they destroy the civilization you built as they wretchedly crawl through its wrecked ruins, they will still live better than in anything they could ever have built for themselves. Only you stand between the nightmare of socialistic slavery and the bright hope of tomorrow. And you beautiful and brave women, resisting government's treacherous proposal to marry it, rather than accepting a golden ring from one clear-eyed man dreaming of a shared tomorrow. You gorgeous and courageous women who smilingly and graciously carry the load of work, marriage, family, inspiring your man to greatness and nurturing your young ones to moral maturity as well as physical. Yes, you happy warriors, men and women, who do all this and have done all this, you are the natural audience for the Rabbi Daniel Lapin Show. You are the audience I devotedly serve, recognizing that every day that I can bring you the helpful, life-affirming insights of ancient Jewish wisdom, well, that is another day of privilege for me, because you are not a tennis ball floating down the gutter of life. You have your hand on the steering wheel of your life. As William Ernest Henley's great poem Invictus ends, I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul. Because you are not tennis balls floating down the gutter of life. It is my honor to serve you all and my delight to welcome you to another episode of the Rabbi Daniel Lapin Show, where I, your rabbi, reveal how the world really works. Yes, that's right. This is the only show in the entire digital universe that reveals how the world really works. This is the only show in the world which offers you calisthenics for the contemplative and strenuous stretching for the soul. I will stand beside you as you attempt speculative somersaults of the spirit. That is how the world really works. And so we move into the subject of today, which is the 5 rules for raising absolutely fantastic children. That's right. Now, I have to explain something. Before we start on the 5 rules, you've got to know that I am going to lay out the best practices model, and then I'm going to leave it to you to adjust for whatever are your own circumstances, even if they are less than perfect. You see, we've all made mistakes in life. That's part of living. It's unavoidable. And I know full well that there are many, many single moms doing a valiant job, devoting themselves to trying to raise their children. There are many people who are divorced. There are people who are on a second marriage, sometimes maybe even a third marriage, with all the perils and the challenges that brings, I realize life isn't perfect. But it makes more sense for me to present an ideal model, and then you make the adjustments for your own particular circumstances, rather than I try and present 5 rules for raising great children. If you work night shift as a court bailiff and are never home, and you're a single dad, and you're also on welfare. Okay, these things happen. I realize that, but you are smart enough to be able to make the adjustment. It's a little bit like trying to cross an ocean on a sailboat. You really want to go with an accurate chart, and you also want to go with an accurate compass. Now, I will assure you that when one is sailing a small sailboat on the open ocean, you really cannot possibly steer to, shall we say, 1 degree of accuracy, right? There's 90 degrees between north and east, and a degree is really quite small. Now, admittedly, over a long distance, a degree error can lead up to a huge error. But you see, you're not supposed to go a huge distance without rechecking your position. I would recheck our position regularly at noon every day, unless the sun wasn't visible, if it was very overcast or raining. But otherwise, I check the position every day, and you try and steer as best you can. I'll tell you honestly, hand steering a sailboat, I'm going to say I feel lucky if I can steer to within 3 to 5 degrees of the desired course. It's just hard. And so maybe I should head out with a compass that's, sort of accurate to about 5 degrees. No, it's best to have a 100% accurate compass. And even though you are still going to make errors and mistakes, you adjust. But it's best to go with instruments that are exact. If you're building a house, you know you're not working to 1 millimeter of accuracy. You know that the ceiling height in every room in your house is going to vary slightly by maybe as much as an inch or 2. That just happens when you're building, because you don't build to that accuracy. It's not needed. But how about if the architect gave you the blueprints for the house and said, you know what, these are accurate to about 6 inches. No, that doesn't work. Errors compound. It becomes messy. And so I tell you that by way of explanation for why it is that I'm going to describe it in best terms, even though we don't all live in an idealized best world situation. And so adjustments will be made. Let me give you an idea. I'm going to be speaking of a 2-parent family, a mother married to her children's father, even though that might not be the position in which you might find yourself. But at least if you have the best blueprint, you're going to modify it and apply it more effectively than if we start off by my presenting to you second-rate compromises and half-hearted hybrids and jumbled confusion. No, that's really not an effective way to do it. Like I said, you're trying to navigate the Atlantic from Miami to Funchal, Madeira. That's 3,000 nautical miles approximately, and to get there you're supposed to steer, shall we say, about 83 degrees. And now that you know that, and you have a compass, off you go. But if we start off saying, you know what, go roughly east, magnetic east, and no, start off with accurate directions, even if it's difficult to actually apply them. So, yes, life is difficult. It's difficult to apply the rules of life. It's difficult to get everything right. And all of us, we all live compromises in a way. All of us live lives that might not be exactly everything we dreamed of when we were 11 years old. But we are mature, and we build successful lives given the circumstances we find ourselves in. So, yes, I really know that not everyone is married, and not everyone who is married is on their first marriage, and not everyone on their first marriage married as a virgin, and not everyone who did that. All right, I get it. I know all that. But with all that said and done, I do think enough of you to know that you can more reliably navigate with accurate charts and instruments regardless of where you are. And so that is why it is. I'm not being insensitive to people with different life circumstances. There's a lot of different variations out there. I get that. But you will be able to make the most of it if you have at least the accurate chart. And the accurate chart is what I'm going to give you. Now, there have been huge distortions in the culture. Words don't always mean exactly what you thought they mean, and so I will always try and be as precise as I can. For instance, here's a story that happened recently in Orlando, Florida, where a man and a woman come in to eat in a restaurant together with an 11-year-old child. And the waiter who runs that restaurant, he was the guy who runs the restaurant, but he was also acting as waiter. He took the order from the man and the woman, and then he said, "What about the boy?" And the man said, "No, he'll eat at home later." But then this woman noticed the kid looked a little bit frightened and even had a few cuts on him, so she became concerned. She thought, I got to do something. So what does this interesting woman do? She writes a note on a piece of paper saying, "Do you need help?" And she stands behind the two adults so they wouldn't see her, and she holds us up so the 11-year-old child can see it. He initially shook his head, but a little while later she came back and held the note again, and this time he shook his head yes, nodded affirmatively, and so she called 911. And she said, "Look, I'm just concerned. I don't know what to do. Can you give me some guidance? The boy's got some bruises. He's not eating. The adults are eating." Okay, bottom line is, the boy was the woman's son. The man was the woman's boyfriend, recent boyfriend. And yes, he had been beating the kid. I think we know already that in the United States, at least, the most dangerous place for a child to find him or herself is at home with mom and mom's live-in boyfriend. It's obvious, right? Because the man has no connection to the child. And as far as he's concerned, the child is a competitor for mom's attention. So it's never, ever, seldom, should I say, a good situation. Anyway, why am I telling you this? Because I want to tell you the headline, the newspaper headline of the story is, restaurant manager sees bruised boy and writes note, the parents are charged. The parents, did you hear that? The parents are charged. Yeah, they were charged by the police, but they're not parents. It's the mother and her boyfriend. They're not parents. Please note that before 1962, this never would have appeared like this. The papers would have been precise. But because the declining culture wants to erode the structure of the traditional family, the first thing it does is eliminate any precise definitions. And it has, by the way, this the New York Times did formally in instructions to editors and to journalists and to writers that any arrangement of people living together constitutes a family. Parents are anybody who lives with a child. And so the newspaper journalist who wrote this article, and this is from June of this year, 2022, they followed instructions to call these two people the boy's parents. But they're not the boy's parents. It's the boy's mom and the mom's boyfriend. That makes a huge difference. And so whenever you see statistics now that say, whatever percentage it is of children get abused by their fathers, don't believe it. It isn't true. They are abused by mom's boyfriend. But the new distortion of language calls that a father. So it's worthwhile, I think, being really aware of how one simply cannot count any longer on trusting news reports of that kind. And that's really, in almost every area, major distortion of how the news works. Here is another example. A few years ago, the New York Times, and the reason I speak about the New York Times is because it is the most significant and substantive water carrier for socialistic and secular policies. But a few years ago, the New York Times ran a sort of editorial disguised as a news story that said that the majority of American women do not live with husbands. And the point of the story was that, you see, it's no longer needed. Long time ago, in those primitive, far-off days, women needed men, but now they don't. And the proof of it is that we're making such good progress in America. The majority of American women do not live with a husband. And you have to dig deeply into this to discover, which I didn't do, but it has been done, and Thomas Sowell actually did part of it, and other people worked on this. How did the New York Times arrive at this figure that a majority of American women do not live with husbands? Well, they kept on lowering the age of the women they were checking into using census data, and eventually they took it down to the age of 16. Well, yeah, quite a lot of 16 and 17-year-old women do not live with husbands. That's true. But the New York Times was going to do anything necessary in order to bring up the number of women without husbands up to 51%, so they can say the majority. And they also counted widows, who by definition do not live with husbands, but they did one at one time. So they go from age 16 all the way up to elderly women whose husbands have died, and they count all of these as women who do not live with husbands. They also counted wives whose husbands were away in the military, and they also counted women whose husbands were in prison. And using these extremely creative techniques, they finally got it to 51% of women were not living with a husband. And now this was, they could call it most women or majority women, and this was a news story. And this shows, look, the majority of women in America have realized they don't need husbands. Okay, that's just how destructive this stuff is. The San Francisco Chronicle reran that story with a headline, "Women See Less Need for the Old Ball and Chain." In other words, marriage is like a prison sentence. And look, this picture of marriage and family as a burden is not unique to the New York Times or the San Francisco Chronicle. This is part of the message of the left, and this has been true ever since Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels put out the Communist Manifesto and Marx's book Capital. All of these things are intending to undermine and ultimately destroy the existence of marriage and family as the fundamental unit of society. It's a reality. That is really what is happening, and it's awful. Anyways, with that background, we can... I've got one more thing to tell you, but I think maybe I'll tell you that inside the 5 rules, okay? So I think we can go on to the 5 rules for raising great children. But I also, you know what, why don't I also just remind you of the website, and that is rabbidaniellapin.com. And let me tell you what you're going to find there. You're going to find an online course called the Financial Prosperity Package, and that is something, it's 10 hours of video lessons from me, which you can take at your own speed and your own time. With inflation, what it is, and I think I've told you, inflation is much higher than 8.5%. 8.5% is the figure acknowledged by the government, but the reality is that the way of measuring inflation was substantially tampered with during the time that Newt Gingrich was Speaker of the House in the early 90s. And the reason they did that was they wanted to show a lower rate of inflation so as that the cost of living adjustment made to Social Security recipients would be less. And this was a way of trying to minimize the deficit. All these are, in other words, what I'm telling you is that for an ordinary citizen like you or me, it is impossible to delve into the machinations of government statistics and measurements and reports. You've got to understand the Bureau of Labor Statistics, which produces the cost of living, the CPI, that index, and other similar indices used for measuring inflation. These are staffed by thousands, not tens, thousands of people who morning to night are working out arcane and detailed ways of getting what their bosses want. And, you've got a life. You have a limited amount of time to devote to reading up on how inflation is measured, and you go with the number. How can you not? What alternative do we have? And the government says 8.5%. Let me just tell you, having devoted considerable amounts of time on your behalf to try and do this for you, I got to tell you that this is not good news, by the way. I've got to tell you that at the moment, I would estimate that the actual rate of inflation is running close to 15%, nearly double of what the government is acknowledging. And it's I'm recording this a week before the 4th of July weekend, and so it's only another 7 or 8 or 9 days, and you're going to be on the road. Maybe you're going to be filling up gas. I think it's going to dawn on you also that the change in prices is not 8.5%. It's a whole lot more than that. And if you go to the market and you're going to buy meat for hamburgers, and you buy hot dogs and whatever you're going to buy, you're going to notice as well the shrinkage of packaging, right? And the idea is that way they don't raise the price, they reduce the amount you get, which is, again, just another example of inflation, but it's not reflected in the official government figure of 8.5%. So just be aware that if there is ever a time to try and figure out a way to increase your income, a way to enhance your revenue, a way to make more money and create more wealth, now would be a really good time to do it. Because if you could give yourself an increase of 15% of your income, maybe that's starting a side business, a side hustle, maybe it's getting a raise, maybe it's making yourself more valuable. There's a lot of things, I can't go into them all here, but if you can do that and increase yourself by 15%, well, then for you, inflation is zero. You've zeroed it out and you're able to keep pace with everything. So there really is value in trying to increase your revenue, and the Financial Prosperity online training course at my website at rabbidaniellapin.com is a very good place to start. And secondly, in terms of gaining an understanding into Bible, understanding how it impacts your life and how its permanent principles can be used profitably as you navigate your way through life. Look, I must tell you that I think we are watching the decline of materialism, and I think that more than ever at the present time, understanding of the Bible, knowledge of the Bible will stand you in very good stead. More so than in 1960, because, in 1960, things in America looked pretty good. And by extension, in the rest of the world, 1960, in the United Kingdom, in most of Europe, even South America, various countries were having the ups and downs. But there's no comparison, to what's going on right now everywhere. And so a deeper understanding of what's happening and an increase in your ability to wisely and effectively analyze what's going on, I do believe that Bible is a very helpful starting point. And so again, at my website at rabbidaniellapin.com, we have prepared for you something called Scrolling Through Scripture. And it's really rather remarkable. Unit 1 takes us through the first 34 verses of Genesis. You might say, really? Like hours of study, which you can do at your own speed, to get through just 34 verses? Well, yeah, it picks up speed a little bit later, but so many fundamental principles are being laid out here. Things you need for your family and your finances, for your friendships, and for your fitness, and for your faith. All of that laid out in the first 34 verses. In fact, it's interesting that the first chapter of Genesis is 31 verses. Why didn't I stop at the end of chapter 1 with 31 verses? Well, it turns out that the first 3 verses of chapter 2 are actually part of chapter 1. They really belong with chapter 1. Did you know that? Well, not only do I tell you that, but I'll show you how you can see it. And then you will understand why you've got to do the first 34 verses all together. So it's called Scrolling Through Scripture, and you'll find that in the online course section on the website rabbidaniellapin.com. So do visit, explore that, and see if that can enhance your life as much as I think it actually will do. So go ahead and explore the website, rabbidaniellapin.com, and let's move on to the 5 rules for raising great children. Rule number 1. Rule number 1 is work on your marriage. It really does help your children. When children grow up and they see a passionate, loving, committed marriage in their parents, it's a huge benefit to those children. I'm not going to cite all the studies. You know what I think of studies and experts, but there actually are compelling studies that children who grow up in that kind of family, where mother and father are married to one another, and the marriage is a passionate, loving, committed marriage, those kids have notably improved outcomes, school-wise, behavior-wise, in every possible area. Where this has practical impact is, for instance, sometimes parents would consult me with a disagreement, and that was really one of the main functions that I served as rabbi of my congregation years back, is helping to maintain marital peace by resolving any disputes that come up. And a dispute that is resolved by an outside party is much better than a dispute that is resolved by one party dominating the other or overwhelming the other. And so one of them was, and this used to happen quite often, where the husband would say, I've got a business trip, but it's to, I won a sales award or whatever it was. It's to a really nice destination. It's 3 days, all expenses paid, and we're invited to bring our spouses along. And she'd say, yeah, but our youngest is only 2 years old, and she's not used to me being away. She expects me to be around, and so I just don't feel comfortable leaving her. The answer is that animals work on a maternal instinct. People have to go beyond that. People have to understand that yes, there is a maternal instinct. But your first priority is your husband, not your children. That is a difficult thing for a human for a human mother, I should say, to learn, because there's such a strong pull to that new baby or that young child, or to all the children, that it's extremely difficult. But it nonetheless is correct. She absolutely should go. The baby's going to do just fine with the grandparents or whatever arrangement you make. But there's no question, barring certain tough conditions that I don't know about. But ordinarily, in the situations I've described and encountered, I was always very big on that happening. And for the older children to see how much mom and dad love being together with one another and how much they enjoy one another's company, it was something I grew up with, by the way. Whenever my mom walked into the room, you could see my dad's eyes light up, like no matter what was going on. But when she walked in, he perked up. He liked it. And that's a good thing. It's a very, very good thing. Also, I should point out that there is no Hebrew word for a single mother or a single father. In the Lord's language, the word parent is a plural. There is no singular version, signifying that the task is actually a two-person task. It's a mother and a father task. Also, I should add that, again, part of constructing a really happy, fulfilled, positive, committed family is obviously based on a deep connection between husband and wife. And something that not all of you lady happy warriors might know is that men are happiest with a woman who needs them. In other words, the idea that the feminist movement has been pushing for 50 years, that a woman needs a man like a fish needs a bicycle, ha ha ha, very witty, but incredibly destructive to marriage. And this is one of the reasons that women who are extraordinarily successful financially do find difficulty in getting married and finding a great husband. They find it very, very difficult. Why? Because a man finds that being needed is hugely important. Not being needed is being made to feel unnecessary and redundant, and that is just one step away from a feeling of total impotence, which for a man is unbearable. And so needing a husband, needing your man, is a very wise thing for a smart wife to do. I'm going to tell you a true story. It's a sad story, but it's shocking, and it's important that it happened and that we know about it. This is a story that was published originally by the New York Times. Yes, here it is. It was published in the New York Times weekly magazine in May 2004, and here's how the story begins. It's entitled "One Very Tangled Post-9/11 Affair." It was the evening of September the 10th, 2002, when John Zazulka Zizalka, a New York City firefighter, sat down with his wife Susan in their Staten Island home and told her that their marriage of 19 years was over. At least that's how Susan remembers it. The eve of the one-year anniversary of 9/11, the last night of the worst year of their lives. John, on the other hand, says it might have been a few weeks before or after, or who knows, maybe Susan even remembers it right, but so what? If so, he says, it was just a coincidence, one of those things that everyone wants to see as a symbol of something more than it is. He isn't, he says, a big one for reading too much into things. Soon it became clear to Susan that the reason John left her was not, as he originally told her, that he had long been unhappy, or rather it became clear that it wasn't his only reason. A few months earlier, he had met and become involved with another woman, a woman living in Ronkonkoma, New York, named Deborah Amato. It is always somewhat mystifying, but not unusual, when a man leaves his wife for a woman who seems similar to the one he has just left. Like Susan, Debbie was in her early 40s, very attractive, trim, a mother to 4 children, a stay-at-home mom who had hardly worked outside the home since the day she married her firefighter husband. Okay. What's the story? I'm not going to read the whole thing, obviously, but to just give you the story, what happened is that in the direct aftermath of that 9/11 horrible day, when so many New York firefighters lost their lives, all of a sudden the fire department in New York, which sort of sees it itself as a brotherhood, men who put themselves in danger, it's rather like the military, and all of a sudden they had a large number of widows, like overnight, all of a sudden. There was this big number of families that had been left fatherless and husbandless because of the attacks of 9/11 and the firefighters who died in the Twin Towers. And so the fire department did something which on the surface of it would appear to be, perfectly normal and perfectly natural. Had they consulted your rabbi, he would have told them how to avoid the problem. What did they do? For every widow, they assigned another firefighter to help her, to get, just help her deal with the paperwork. And I mean, you know what is involved when somebody passes away. There's a huge amount of paperwork. There's bank accounts. There's insurance issues. It's just can be overwhelming. And so every widow from 9/11 in the New York Fire Department was assigned a firefighter, colleague of her late husband, to help her. And he'd go there a few times a week and sit down with her and go through the paperwork and, talk with the children a bit and just be just be there to help. If they would have consulted your rabbi, would have said, great idea, excepting you must assign 2. There should never be a man by himself. It should always be 2 men. Why? Well, it's perfectly obvious. And that is that for a man, it is powerfully sexual to be able to help a woman. I'm using that word advisedly because I want to get to the core of it. I want you to really understand what's going on here. And so for a man to be in a position of being needed by this woman and for her to be grateful to him and to look up at him with admiration and gratitude for helping her get through this stuff, that is powerfully moving. And, of course, for the woman to suddenly have a guy there with broad shoulders who is, it's all but unstated. He's a replacement for the husband. Husband's gone. Here's this guy. And I could tell you even more about it, but that's enough for now. Bottom line is that the New York Fire Department in the months following 9/11 was beset by a huge number of divorces. And this article in the New York Times from 2004 starts off telling the story of one, this woman, Susan Zizalka, whose husband had been assigned to a 9/11 widow named Debbie. And the funny thing is that Susan and Debbie, they were very, very similar life paths, similar age, similar everything. Even the author says they even looked similar. And so it's not as if John Zizalka left his wife Susan, for a 23-year-old hottie. No, not at all. because there's something even much more important than hotness, as they say, and that is being needed. And that, I want you to know just how very powerful this thing is. And that, so why didn't his own wife need him? Because, they got an established household, everything's running normally, and you understand how this happens, that a husband and wife can easily fall into a pattern where they've formed a very nice little socio-economic unit. The rent gets paid or the mortgage gets paid, and they, maybe they go to church together every third Sunday or whatever it is. But is there a case of sort of primal, palpable need? No, not at all. That's gone. But in the case of the 9/11 widows, there really was. So please just be aware. The culture is moving us towards women being proud not to need men. The smart, happy warrior wife is proud to need her husband. Really, it makes a huge difference. Think about it, and you'll see that this is very, very relevant, very applicable. So just reject this message you hear from the culture all the time. Women don't need men. And men and women in marriage are exactly the same. Stop it already. This is bad for intimacy. It's bad for the marriage. And apropos of today's topic, it's bad for your children. Okay. That's rule number 1 of the 5 rules. Work on your marriage all the time, constantly. Okay? All right, let's go to rule number 2. Rule number 2 is be on the same page. For heaven's sake, be on the same page. Make sure that you don't turn your child into ammunition in an argument between the two of you. Make sure that your children know that when they get an instruction or a direction from either father or mother, that both parents are solidly behind that decision. It should never work that a child who has been disciplined or directed can go to the other spouse, can go to the other parent and say, Mommy said this, do I really have to do this? And the worst thing in the world is if the father says, no, come on here, I'll talk to Mommy, it'll be all right. It's a disaster. Very difficult to recover from. If you've been doing this, please know that the repair is going to take more than a year, depending on the age of your children. And so you really have to be very, very much aware of that. If you're interested in the biblical source of this, go to Deuteronomy chapter 21, verse 18. And it's talking there about a rebellious and problematic, a child who's just not listening to his parents. And what it says is, it's fascinating. Now, here I should tell you that most Bible translations of Deuteronomy 21:18 get it wrong. I'm pretty sure the King James Bible gets it correct, and the Hebrew, of course, is what I go to. And what it says is, so if this is a bad son, a rebellious son, who does not listen to the voice of his parents, you'd think it would say, or he doesn't listen to the voice of his mother and father. And I think that's how the NIV translates it. But no, you know what the Hebrew says? This is a rebellious child. He does not listen to the voice of his father and to the voice of his mother. You want a rebellious child? You want a problematic child? Make sure the voice of the father and the voice of the mother are different. That's why the text of Deuteronomy 21:18 phrases it in that way. This rebellious son, bad son, doesn't listen to the voice of his father and to the voice of his mother. Yeah, they're different. Try and avoid that. You don't want. Every parental decision is exactly that. It's a parental decision. A family, through the husband and the wife make a decision. It's not a decision by one foisted on the other. And so, yes, you and your spouse should definitely discuss things. But let's imagine that your spouse has not discussed something with you, and just because of the exigency of the moment, your spouse was called on to make a ruling. No, because of this, you may not go play with Johnny this afternoon because you were. At that point, your role as the spouse is to back that up 100%, even if you think it was wrong. And then afterwards, privately, when the two of you are alone, you say, let's talk about what happened this afternoon. Tell me why you reacted the way you did, and tell me, why did you make the consequence of that behavior that our child can't go and play with his friend this afternoon? And then talk about that. And this is part of the way you grow in your marriage, and you grow as husband and wife, and you grow as parents. It's a very good thing. You discuss it, and you keep at this, and eventually you'll arrive at a modus operandi where you'll say, okay, there may be some exceptions, but generally speaking, this is what we have to, this is the way we should do this. That's wonderful. That's exactly the way these things should happen. So if your spouse makes an out loud decision without having discussed it, with you first thing you do is agree and back them up. And then afterwards you have a conversation with your spouse. You can say, I don't feel that was right. We ought to have discussed it first. It's tempting to reward children with candy and toys. And it's very frustrating with a mom who's at home who deals with the children all day, and particularly if you're not homeschooling and the children come home from school and they're hot and bothered and there's homework to be done and all this sort of thing. And for dad then to come home and offer treats when there may have been issues during the day that she wants to discuss with him, don't reward with candy and toys, unless you've both decided on it, in which case it's a treat from both parents, not from one. Don't try and score points off your spouse with the child. You're doing those things really cost you in terms of family harmony and tranquility, in terms of marital satisfaction. Don't do those things. Don't act unilaterally, please. You are a husband and you are a wife. You are parents. Look, I'm not saying moms and dads agree all the time. Of course not. But do that in private so that the children only see a united front. Right? So, you and your spouse will grow by discussing and figuring out. Children are God's way of ensuring you don't stay a child forever yourself. Children are God's way of making you grow. So this is a wonderful thing to have constant child-raising discussions with your spouse, in which you throw out some old ways, find new ways, discuss ways, arrive at consensus, and don't ever, if you're the dad, don't ever say to your children, mom doesn't like you coming to the table in pajamas, or whatever it is. Don't do that, because again, you're stating that you're on the other side. You don't agree. Have you heard people say it? I hear it all the time when we're guests in people's homes. We hear all the time people say, go and put on a shirt. Your father doesn't like you coming to the table like that, or whatever it is. So try and avoid that kind of thing. Okay, I'm hoping you've got the idea here, right? So number one was work on your marriage. Number two is please be on the same page with respect to your children. Number three is don't disagree or argue in front of your children. In fact, in front of your children, you must honor one another. So rule number three is honor one another, and part of that means you don't disagree with your spouse in front of the children, okay? Get used to saying things like, if you're speaking to your child, say, we think, or we want you to do this. Also, in public, in general, to other people, don't say, my daughter, my son, my home, my house. Always say, our son, our children, our daughter, our house, our motor car, whatever it is. But emphasize the unity, and never miss an opportunity to build up the honor of the children for the other spouse. Never miss an opportunity. If you're waiting for supper and dad hasn't come home, right? Mother can either say, I don't know what it is with your father. He can't seem to come home on time. Or the mother could also say, do you have any idea of what a wonderful father you have, who is willing to work so hard that we can have all the things we need? Think about it. If he wasn't taking care of us, all the money he makes he could spend on whatever he wants. Do you think there's anything he'd like to buy that he hasn't been able to? I think there is. Likewise, get up at the end of a meal, and father makes a point of thanking mom for dinner. Thank you for that wonderful dinner. And then even say, the children and I really appreciate how much effort you put into giving us delightful, nutritious, tasty, great dinners. You don't miss an opportunity to build up the children's respect for the other spouse, okay? So work on your marriage is number one. Be on the same page is number two. Honor one another by not disagreeing in front of the children is number three. Here's number four. Keep your word. You know, if you haven't started raising children yet, you probably think, what's so hard about that? I keep my word all the time. You will discover that what I said is true. God really gives us children to make us better people. And what does keeping your word mean? Well, it's so easy when you are frustrated and you're being pulled in three directions. You know, you may have 4 children or 5 or 2, whatever it is, but it's just one of those days you're not really coping, and the children are frustrating you, and it's just one of those days. And it's so easy to say, you're going to bed without dinner for the next 3 days. Look, you shouldn't have said it. Don't make flamboyant or undoable threats. But once you've done that, you have to keep your word. Because otherwise, little by little, your children learn your word means nothing. And so that's a disaster for discipline. And they don't learn internal self-discipline, which is one of the great gifts you can give your children, is that they grow up with self-discipline. All of that comes from keeping your word. Don't say, if you do that one more time, we're canceling the Disneyland trip. Your child knows you've already bought the tickets and you've committed to the trip and you've blocked out time off work. You're not going to cancel the trip. But if you say that, it's really bad. Don't speak if you don't mean it. Don't parent by bribing and threatening. It's not the way to do it. Obviously you do, the smart thing, everybody knows this, is you praise your children every time they do something right. Make a big fuss every time they do. Little by little they learn that that's the big thing. That's the good thing. But discipline consistently and sanely, not insanely, but sanely. You cannot parent a child by ignoring bad behavior or infractions day after day after day, and then finally, when you just can't stand it anymore and you lose it, you come up with this monstrous, huge punishment. It doesn't make sense. It doesn't work. Just think about speeding. If everybody who speeds on the highway, would get a $20 fine right there, you'd never get away with it. There's always, you speed, you get a $20 fine. You'd see that people would become disciplined towards driving within the speed limit. But what some countries do is, they have very few people on the road, police on the road, but every now and then when they catch somebody, they charge them hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of dollars in fine, or they do something to their license. A huge punishment every now and then is totally ineffective compared to a reasonable punishment on a completely reliable and consistent basis. Okay? So there are work on your marriage is number one. Be on the same page is number two. Number three is honor your spouse and no disagreements in front of the children. That's part of honoring your spouse. Finding ways to honor your spouse. Number four is keep your word. Just keep your word. You got to do that. And number five, Number 5 is family meetings. Have regular family meetings. How regular? Once a week is pretty good. Once every 2 weeks or once every month. If depending on the age of the children and the structure of the family. But a family meeting is a really good idea, and nothing interferes with it. And for heaven's sake, do not have your phone in front of you at the family meeting. Your attention is entirely on the meeting. All you should have in front of you is your notebook, for your family meeting notebook with a date on today's page, and you've prepared an agenda that you've already laid out some of the things you want to discuss. You speak about things that have been going well in the family, things that you and your spouse don't feel have been going so well. Make it fun. Let each person, invite them to speak. Ask questions. It doesn't come naturally for anybody, but you have to work on it, and then after a while, family meetings become so fun. Children really enjoy it. They know they've got your attention 100%, and sometimes it can even be tied to a special dinner. I used to make homemade French fries very often for family meetings, and to this day my children will still say, and I don't think they're just saying this to me, I think this is a definitive consensual opinion on gastronomic expertise. My children insist that the French fries I made from scratch were the best they've ever tasted. I measured the temperature of the oil. I chose exactly the right potatoes. I sliced them in a very specific way, etc., etc. But when things like that are tied to family meetings, it also makes it fun. You can talk about things having to do with the home. The lawn isn't looking good. Dad has to work harder for the next 2 months. The family meeting helps you make sure your family never sinks down to being no more than a socio-economic unit of a socialistic-leaning society. So yes, of course, there's chores, there's work, there's all kinds of routine and mundane things that go into keeping a life running smoothly and keeping a family running smoothly. But a family is also a place for security and comfort and happiness and delight. And the family meeting is one of those times where you can do those things. If there is ever going to be, let's say there's going to be a family vacation, so you would announce it at a family meeting. We always, do a summer boating trip in British Columbia, and we always made it a family meeting to announce the next year. Usually it would be about January or February, in the middle of the winter, and during the fact we got a big announcement for this family meeting. And what is it? Well, we've made arrangements for this summer's family boating trip. This is where we're going to be doing, what we're going, and etc., etc. All right, so I'm hoping that you get the idea. Those are the 5 principles. How you apply these in your individual life and in your own circumstances is, of course, up to you, because I know that a happy warrior like you will have no trouble doing that, applying it, figuring out what have I taught today that is applicable to your family, what isn't, how can you apply it, and how can you go at it and beyond. I've done these very quickly. I've told you the 5 rules. I'll tell them to you again. I've given you examples and a little bit of background, but I could talk for an entire show on each one of these rules. I really could. But I don't think it's necessary, because I think you get the idea and you are able to do this. Now, I'll tell you one of the frustrating things is, what do you do if a family, let's say you've got a brother-in-law, your sister and brother-in-law are making an absolute disaster of the kids they're raising, your nieces and nephews, and and it's frustrating for you to be there because you see them making all these mistakes. Flamboyant, unmanageable threats. If you do this will throwing out a punishment. Well, for that you're not going to get another candy for the next 10 years. And you know they're making a mistake on these things, but you certainly, as an outsider, you certainly can't say anything. Well, one of the things you might be able to do, I'm hoping, is say, hey, we get a lot of benefit from the Rabbi Daniel Lapin Show. Here's how you can listen to it. Maybe that might be work, and then maybe they'll listen to this show as well. Who knows? But the 5 rules again: work on your marriage. It's so important a part of raising good children. Be on the same page, right? Don't disagree with your spouse. Be on the same page in terms of child raising rules and principles. Remember Deuteronomy chapter 21, verse 18. Number 3 is honor one another. Mother and father should go out of their way to honor one another and to show respect and love and admiration to one another, and that gets modeled for the children. Number 4 is keep your word. And number 5 is family meetings. Take them seriously and train yourself to listen carefully while your children are speaking, because your rapt attention is precisely what will encourage them to talk up in a family meeting. It's great for sibling relationships. It's great for every aspect of family relationships. So family, again, it's a discipline. It's not easy. Busy families, there are all kinds of activities and events, but try and lock yourself in. Maybe once a week is hard to do, so start off maybe once every 2 or 3 weeks, but whatever it is, put them on the calendar. If you keep a calendar on the fridge in the kitchen, make sure it's there, just so everybody knows when exactly the family meeting is, and make it something they look forward to. Sometimes Susan Lapin would have a tray of her favorite cookies that she'd have baked specifically for the family meeting, and there's milk or chocolate milk or whatever it is, but make it fun to be at the family meeting. Those, my dear happy warriors, are the 5 rules for raising great kids, and I hope that they will be useful either for you or for people you know and love. And that takes us as far as we go for today, wishing you a wonderful week of growth in your family. That's where we're talking today. Growth in your family, in your finances, in your faith, in your friendships, and in your physical fitness as well. Thanks so much for being part of the show. Until next week, I'm Rabbi Daniel Lapin. God bless.